Glad you could join me again today. I've been reading a book by a man named Mario Bergner, and his book is entitled Setting Love in Order. Well, his subject is the hope and the healing for homosexuals. And I've been gleaning some real insight into why people hurt and how a person's upbringing has such a profound and really a long-lasting effect in their life. And his own personal story is one of really great sadness. His father was German, and he survived the World War II death camps and married a French girl. And they both experienced a tremendous amount of prejudice and rejection from their home nationals, and really because the German had married the French. They considered it a mixed marriage, and so it was not something that was very well received after World War II. So the family moved to Canada, and they only faced more prejudice. And then they moved to America, and there they felt unwelcomed as well, basically because they were German and French. And the father, he suffered from nightmares from the things that he experienced in the death camps, and he was a man of anger who lashed out and injured his family in those ways. And it's really a sad story, but very believable given the history of these parents. But eventually the author comes to Christ and he begins the healing process. And he writes very candidly about how he felt, about growing up, about how things affected him, how he viewed things. But what caught my attention was the understanding he had between the difference between self-pity and grief. And he talks about sorting out the things that have happened in our past so that we can have the right view on them. And so that our mental health can be improved. And how we process and resolve these things really greatly determines our success, our peace, and our happiness. And no doubt many of us have things that we don't want to bring out on the table, things we put in the closet, parts of our history that we struggle with, we find it hard to understand, or maybe even things that we're ashamed of, or that bring us anger, or maybe we suffered unfairness or abuse, or we have a difficult time forgiving. Well, after he shared his story in the first couple of chapters, he began looking at two ways that people deal with their past. And he said they either fall into self-pity or they work through it with a healthy measure of redemptive grief. And I know there was a time in my life when I had to face some of the things in my past and come to a measure of forgiveness for my parents, for other things that had happened, and get a better way of looking at life. And I really praise the Lord that he helped me to move from self-pity and anger into more solid ground. So today I want to talk to you about his comparison between self-pity and grief. And I want you to look and see if you can see yourself in some of these things. Basically, he gives us 6 things. He says self-pity is destructive, but grief heals. And why is that? Well, because self-pity never has a resolution, does it? It's always poor me. But grief usually arrives at a place of acceptance, a place of peace where you can let the thing rest in peace and you move on. You heal from it. It doesn't change it. It doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It doesn't mean it's not there. It just means you've accepted it and you're not letting it control you anymore. But self-pity is controlling, isn't it? Then self-pity is weak and whiny. It never makes a clear statement of truth, but lives on blaming and drama. Grief, though, states the facts, and the feelings create strength and a sound communication. The grieving person does hurt, but he knows that grief is a process that will produce cleansing and health, while the person in self-pity is always licking their wounds, always picking at their sores, always whining, always complaining, but grief moves on silently. Self-pity is circular, he says, and descending. In other words, it goes over and over the same event or feeling, and it gets sucked into a downward spiral of poor me. But grief looks up, out of itself, and it focuses on God. And that's exactly what David said in Psalm 121, verse 1 and 2. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. Grief looks to a source outside of self, a source that has power to restore and lift up. It doesn't get sucked into a downward spiral. I've always found that grief, healthy grief, has a table. It's like a table where it sits for a while, and then it gets its unction together, you might say. It gets the strength draws the strength it needs from the Lord, and then it moves on. But self-pity never sits still. It's always circular, it's always spinning, and usually spinning downward. Self-pity does not do the basics of survival, he says. Eating, resting, work, personal care, all of these things suffer when we're in self-pity, and God and his word are ignored. Prayer becomes a complaint, and relationships are strained when we are in the throes of self-pity. But those who grieve properly maintain the basics with God and with their self and others. And I think that's, again, where you get to that plateau where you just, you might say you're surviving, you're coping with grief, but you're not falling into the pits of despair. You're coping with God, you're coping with yourself, you're coping with others until you gain the strength to go on. I think that's where David talks about waiting on the Lord, where he will strengthen our hearts if we wait upon him. But self-pity doesn't want to wait. Self-pity wants the attention, and so it just does everything it can to draw that attention and to let people know that I'm hurting by not eating, by breaking up relationships, by not resting, by failing at my jobs, anything I can to call attention to the fact that I'm not doing well, because it's hurting, isn't it? But it's not dealing with it in a healthy manner. Self-pity dramatizes the past. It just can't let go, and it keeps feeding the hurt. But grief communicates the hurt to God to receive comfort, laying it at the foot of the cross. And grief has constructive communication with trusted friends in prayer and in the inner man. There's no drama or trauma there. Self-pity lives in drama and trauma, always looking for a way to express it. But grief lays it down at God's feet. It finds comfort, and it looks for the comfort in God and in its communication with others. It knows to go the right place, doesn't it? Self-pity, he says, collects wounds, treating them like badges, affirming the validity of their grief. While grief, without denying the hurt, holds a more eternal and balanced outlook, viewing all things as from the loving hand of God. It lays pain at the Father's feet and waits for healing and comfort. And you know, self-pity does collect wounds, doesn't it? It just looks around for things to add to the problem that they've already got, creating a bigger and bigger problem. But grief deals with the one thing at a time and then looks to the Father for the help that it needs. Muriel Bergner writes, self-pity is part of the practice of the presence of the old man, the carnal self, whereas grief is the capacity to hurt, all the while practicing the presence of God. The presence of God, oh, how precious that is in all of our sufferings. He will never leave us nor forsake us, no matter what we face. And we need to keep our eyes off of ourselves and onto him, don't we? And then the author writes, to grieve out one's pain is a legitimate need for the wounded person, and the grace and permission to do so must be given to him or her. Like the psalmist or Job, every Christian must endure true redemptive suffering before God. Dear friend, you may have hurts from your past, things that you need to give to the Lord, hurts that need forgiveness and gentle instructive hand of God, but never fear to bring those things to him by faith. He comforts the downcast and afflicted. That's what he says. Give him permission to heal your heart and never fear his work in your life. He comes to heal and to restore. So if you're drowning in self-pity and on a downward spiral, just stop. Stop where you are and start looking up. That's where your help is going to come from. Tell the Lord your hurt. You can be candidly honest with him. Seek out then a trusted friend and have them pray with you. Grab hold of the promises of God instead of the wanderings of your mind and the self-pity that you're swallowing in. He will give your feet a straight path, and he'll bring great healing to your soul if you'll just ask him. See you next week.